Deathbird Stories by Harlan Ellison. So this is a collection of short stories written by Harlan Ellison. There's 19 stories in this collection, and it was originally published in 1975, and I have this Dell copy here. This was a reprint from Dell that came out, I think, in 1980. But these 19 short stories were all originally published between 1960 and 1974. I also have this Blue Jay Books trade paperback version of this one. And I believe this one has kind of remained in print throughout the years, and I think you can still find it all over the place. And it's probably one of Ellison's one of his most popular short story collections. Now, I've been working my way up to this one. First, I read Ellison Wonderland, which is Ellison's first kind of like science fiction short story collection. I really enjoyed that one, and I still think it's probably my favorite collection of his so far overall. And then I read The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World. This was pretty good, but Ellison definitely got into the new wave kind of era of science fiction during this time, and there's a lot of very edgy, over-the-top stories in this one, and that's kind of where I don't like him normally as much. And so then I moved on and read this one, and I kind of have some of the same feelings. I really liked some of the novel or the short stories in this one. I didn't like quite a few of them, but there's also one in here that I think might be one of my top 10 short stories that I've read in a long time. So, you know, I'm kind of hit and miss with Ellison. When he hits, it really hits. And, you know, I'm not going to talk about him as a person. I've talked about him before. I'm just going to talk about the stories here. And there's an intro where he talks about what he was kind of trying to do with this collection. And he talks about how throughout time, gods have kind of gone extinct in a way just by the fact that people stop worshiping them. So he brings up some examples way back in our history of gods that were worshipped, and no one even thinks about them today. So in a way, those gods have gone extinct, and we have our current gods today, and he speculates that eventually those will come out of favor and we'll have new gods to replace those. So he writes some stories in here that some of the stories have to do with that, trying to invent a new god that has to do with modern society or things that are going on currently. And he does it in Ellison fashion. So a lot of these stories are very over the top. Since there's 19 stories, I'm not going to go through all of them. There was 3 repeats that I read in The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World. So I'm going to kind of go down the list and let's just start with that. So the first story is The Whimper of Whipped Dogs. And this was a kind of a response to something that happened in New York. There was a murder of a lady named Catherine Genovese, and I guess this made the news big time because there was a bunch of bystanders that did nothing, and I think her body even laid there for a while before the cops showed up. And so it was kind of a very it said something about the city of New York, I think, at the time. And so Ellison kind of did a story in a response to that, and kind of have the same setup. There's a bunch of people that witness this murder, but there's also some like telepathy going on with our main character, this female who also witnessed it, and she's kind of absorbing the thoughts of the people that also witnessed it. And then it goes off on the deep end. Okay, then the next story was Along the Scenic Route. That was a repeat from The Beast, and this is a fun, lighthearted book. This is the one about road rage, and it's very entertaining. And then next up was On the Downhill Side. This one I'm kind of mid on. It was about a guy who had died, and he's a ghost wandering around New Orleans, and he has this unicorn with him. He meets this ghost of this woman, and he's kind of thinking back on his life, on some of the bad things that happened relationship wise, and he's trying to kind of redeem himself. The story itself was okay. The thing I took away the most on it is he describes this cemetery in New Orleans called St. Louis Cemetery, and the way he described it was amazing. I really want to go visit it, and I've been wanting to go to New Orleans for quite a while, so I'm definitely going to put that on the list to go check it out. Then we had O Ye of Little Faith. I did not like this one very much. I'm going to skip that. Then we had Neon. Now, this came out in 1973, and it's kind of thought to be a early cyberpunk story, and it was pretty cool. We had a guy in a hospital who gets this like cybernetic implant, and he's kind of reflecting back over parts of his life, and because of this implant, you're not sure what's going on, if it's him, if it's the implant, or if it's something else. And that one was a lot of fun. That was cool. And then Basilisk was next. This was about a guy who was in the Vietnam War. He gets captured and tortured and ends up kind of spilling the beans on some information he wasn't supposed to. The military doesn't know what to do with him, and he ends up kind of making it back to the U.S., and his family doesn't know how to deal with him. It's a very interesting story. Ellison does such a good job giving you this very complex situation and giving you kind of all different angles to look at it, but never really saying if there's a right way to look at it. It was done really well. Then we had Pretty Maggie Money Eyes. This was a bit of a lighthearted one for this collection. It was kind of had two plot lines going on in the beginning. You didn't know how they were going to meet. You had a guy who was gambling, and it was down to his last dollar, and he was going to put it in his slot machine. And then you had this lady who was in an abusive relationship. This was Pretty Maggie Money Eyes. And somehow these two plot lines converge. It had to do with some hauntings of a piece of equipment in Vegas, and it was kind of a fun little story. Then we had Corpse, and this was pretty interesting. This was about a guy who was kind of losing his mind and started to think about cars being in this kind of collective entity where they're sentient in a way. And one of those ones, definitely an unreliable narrator. You don't know exactly what's going on inside this guy's head, but it was kind of a fun one. Then we had Shattered Like a Glass Goblin. This was a repeat from The Beast That Shouted Love. And this one's very interesting. I talked about it before, but it's about a guy who comes back from war, and he finds his girlfriend living in this kind of like drug house. It's pretty funny because he shows up and he's there, and the cops end up coming up to this house, and he's the only sober one. He ends up kind of getting the cops to go away. So everybody in this house wants him to live there so that he can like shoo away the cops anytime they come. But there's a lot of this drug aspect in this one that just makes you wonder exactly what's happening in this story. But once again, written pretty well. Then we had Delusions for a Dragon Slayer. This one I didn't like too much. It was hard to figure out what was going on. The guy died and then kind of became this ship captain. I don't know. That one maybe I liked it enough. Like the plot of it was captivating enough. I'd probably want to reread that at some point. Then we had The Face of Helen Borneo, and this one I wasn't a big fan of. And then we had Bleeding Stones. This is pure shock fiction, in my opinion. It was pretty entertaining just because it was so over the top. So we have this scene in front of St. Peter's Cathedral, and there's all these people that have come to worship, are showing up here because this cardinal's going to give a speech. And right before the cardinal gives his speech, he feels something hit his shoulder, and it's like a drop of blood, and he looks up, and these stone gargoyles come to life and just rain destruction down on this crowd. It is so brutal, so over the top. It is Harlan Ellison's descriptive writing takes center stage in this one. And if you're a little weak in the stomach, maybe stay away from that one. But it was, like I said, it was a shock story, I think. Then we had At the Mouse Circus. This one I did not really get or like at all. It was about this king in Tibet doing his thing there, and then he goes over to America and something happened. I don't know. It's so bizarre. I don't even know how to talk about that one. And then we had The Place with No Name. This was the last repeat story that was also in here, so I've already talked about that. But I didn't really like it too much. It was kind of Ellison's retelling of the story of Prometheus, but because it's Ellison, it involved a drug addict pimp and an underage prostitute and some brutal scenes, and yeah, just not one I was a fan of. Then we had Pain God. This is where Ellison was really kind of trying to reinvent these gods in a way. So if you could imagine a god of pain, and this is kind of told as an alien, and he ends up coming to Earth randomly in a way, and it was pretty interesting. That is kind of like this idea: you can't have joy without pain, you can't have love without hate, all the lightness and dark, this kind of duality. And so kind of giving a little props to a pain god in a way. It was pretty interesting story. And then we had Ernest the Machine God, and this was about a lady who broke down near this small town in her car, and these three guys that work at this like gas station kind of refuse to help her out or fix her car, and they're acting really strange. And then this guy Ernest shows up who fixes her car, and then it gets really bizarre between our main character. She's portrayed as, I think she's like this supermodel or very glamorous lady, and this guy Ernest is almost like this savant, and there's some really weird scenes that happen at the end of that one. And then we got Rock God. This one is very weird. I didn't like it. I maybe would need to reread it to understand it a little bit better. But once again, he's trying to turn some issues into gods, and this was the one I didn't get the most out of these god kind of stories. Okay, the second to the last story, I'll just post it here because it's quite a mouthful. This one was probably my second favorite in the collection. This is about a guy who is sort of immortal and he wants to die, but in order to do this, he needs to locate his soul, the geographic location of his soul. Now, this has some of Ellison's most over-the-top prose. I almost call it Vermilion prose, and it is insane to think someone could write in this format because it is so over the top, but it still makes sense. He strings together words and sentences that boggle the mind for me in the technical aspect of writing. And the story itself is pretty interesting. This guy ends up like getting the help from Victor Frankenstein, and they go on this journey. It was very insane. He tried to bring a lot of like hard science into this one in Ellison fashion. Probably one of the most science fiction based ones in this collection. I really liked it, and I definitely want to reread it again. It had some very cool underlying themes that came up in it as well. And then the last story in this collection is kind of the title here. It's The Deathbird. And I really love this one. Like I said, this is the one that was probably one of my top 10 short stories that I've read in the last few years. And it is so bizarre. It's very experimental. As soon as you start reading this story, the narrator is quizzing you, giving you kind of these multiple choice questions, definitely guiding you down a certain path in a way. At one point, this kind of this tester is asking you to write a essay in 500 words or less. It's kind of sprinkled out through the story. And then The real meat of the story is kind of the story of man, from its beginning. If you think about the Christian origination of man, and following this man all the way to the death of the planet Earth. There is so many themes that are brought up in this one, with good and evil and compassion and the hard aspects of losing people, loved ones, pets. There's this excerpt in this short story where Ellison goes completely autobiographical and tells a story about having to put his dog down that brought me to tears. And it was just such an experimental story that, some of these that Ellison does that are this experimental, I don't really like. But this one just came together for me, and I think if you don't like Ellison at all, you're probably not going to like this one. I think you have to like some aspects of his writing to even get into this story. But man, this one really hit for me. I don't know. Let me know some other short stories that I should look for here, or maybe some anthologies I have. Approaching Oblivion and Strange Wine. So probably take a little bit of a break from Ellison for a few months at least before I dip back into him. But I am going to maybe, I'm probably going to do a video with a viewer who's a big Ellison fan, and we've been corresponding back and forth. So look for a video on that coming out later. So it's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.